All right, welcome, Mohammed, to the show. Thank you so much for joining today. Now, you are a co-founder of Tailwarden, and you've been previously a developer, head of DevOps, a serial entrepreneur. Before we jump into that career path leading up to what you've built now, how would you explain Tailwarden to your grandparents?
I would explain Terwana to my grandparents as working with companies that uses cloud providers. What a cloud provider is basically a company that offer you like access to your digital resources from internet
Mm.
instead of using your own computer. So just want to make sure that company that uses those cloud providers uses the right computers so that they don't waste money and they don't put on risk their infrastructure.
Okay, nice. So, looking back at this career path, how did this all come about? And especially also with your previous foundings, like what's the relationship? When did you feel like, okay, this is the challenge I want to focus on?
Yeah, so basically I have started my career as a software engineer where I worked at a cloud space company where we have been offering connectivity to companies to connect their on-premise infrastructure to cloud providers. It was my first hand-on experience with cloud and DevOps practices. So I decided to switch to DevOps role later on and I joined a deep tech company where I have become the head of DevOps, where I have been managing a multi-cloud infrastructure. Fast forward, I have joined eFounders, which is an European startup studio, and we have launched Crew, which is a company I have co-founded, and we have done Y Combinator. It was a company on the HR space, so it's something which is new to me.
Mm.
But it was really challenging because like building a CRM for recruitment is quite complex feature-wise because you need like to think about data integration, the compliance, customization, etc. Fast forward, I had the urge to come back to work on the cloud space and because everything I have done in the past, like the open source contributions, Commissar, which we'll be discussing in a few, and also the books, because I have written 4 books about cloud native apps, DevOps practices, and even like I have now a newsletter about that topic.
Yeah.
So I just was missing the DevOps adrenaline, so I had to go back and I have launched it to Warden with one of my former colleague that I have met on my previous companies I have worked at.
Nice. We'll talk about your newsletter later, but back to Commissaire. That's basically today the open source version of Tailwarden, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But you've worked on this already way back when? Like, what was the story there? When did you realize this is a problem you need to solve? And what made you come back to that?
Yeah, so as I said, like managing the multi-cloud infrastructure for that company, and we had like thousands of resources, cloud resources, creating different regions, different cloud accounts, different cloud providers. So we're spending thousands of dollars a day on AWS alone. And we had this issue of like transparency and just like to get the visibility on how much we spend on the cloud and which resources do we use and which resources we don't use anymore. And it was very tough for us to get that information without like switching from a cloud provider console to another and getting from one region to another. So I had like to build something and I had built like Commissar as a way to build our cloud asset inventories to give us the full picture of our cloud resources. So it was a first-hand experience or a first-hand problem and that made me like create the project. We made the project open source
Hmm.
and now it has a lot of traction. It has over 3,000 stars, $3 million on the open source project, and it's become one of the main like offering of Tailwarden as a company where we want like to bring visibility and control to developers because developers today are having like a tough time understanding the complexity of cloud providers. And we think like the open source is the best model to address the complexity of cloud providers, like because these cloud providers, they offer a wide range of services and features and options. And also you have the widespread adoption of Kubernetes and service, which makes it very hard for developers to pick the right technology, the right solution. And as a result, you have a lot of issues when it comes to the money, which is why I said you have security issues, like compliance issues. And we think like by making the cloud more transparent and collaborative, we can solve that problem. So we started with Commissar to first give them the visibility on what they have on the cloud. And that's the main idea and story where Commissar have started and where it's going in the upcoming years.
What was the biggest challenge building Commissaire?
I think like the biggest challenge, as I said, was like supporting the range array of services
Hmm.
of cloud providers. Like just to give you an example, AWS alone last year, they have announced more than 100 new services and features. That's why like open source is the best model to address this complexity because you cannot cover the long tail of native platforms and tools.
Hmm.
And of course, like since we are also an open core company, like we are building in public when it comes to our KPIs, financial KPIs, our metrics. So like because we want to build a platform for the 99% of developers, we want everyone to be engaged and help us and building this platform. So those are also one of the challenges is like make a product that anyone can use, and at the same time like cover the long tail of the cloud providers and the complexity of the cloud computing landscape.
Nice. So, as an expert in cloud cost, what's like a very specific example of a hidden cost that a lot of people overlook?
I think one of the main like things that like drive the cost waste is like idle resources, which comes from a simple like issue, which is like infrastructure fragmentation. Like you have a lot of cloud resources created by your developers through the cloud console or through the core file, Jenkins file, or infrastructure as code. So it's really cool because it allows you to provision resources easily, but at the same time you end up not tracking those resources. So you have a lot of resources that you don't use, like S3 bucket, EC2 instances, etc., etc. And as a result, like you have a lot of cost which is wasted. That's why like we have focused it first by allowing like developers to have this cloud asset inventory with Commissioner, because we think that the first step to optimize the cost and also improve the security posture is to have the visibility and have the full picture of what you have in the cloud. Then we can like leverage the different frameworks like the well-architected framework of AWS, the FinOps practices to optimize the cost. But without having the data, without having the data infrastructure, it's very hard like to tackle those issues, and also to bring accountability to developers, because developers, they don't have this kind of insight and this kind of data. So it's very hard for them also like to know the actions they are taking that are impacting the monthly bill of the company.
So what are the best practices here? Is the suggestion that everyone should integrate Commissar as early as possible in the project and kind of really use that data once the cloud costs excel, or is this more something that people can integrate later? Are there things that people need to take into account right when they start a new project, or can everything be fixed later? What are the best practices here?
I think it's something you should be doing from the early stage, like connect your infrastructure, have this visibility, and also like start leveraging tags, because tags are really an amazing feature that cloud providers are offering, but it's something that a lot of developers and DevOps engineering cloud practitioners, they are not using, because first of the developer experience, because it's very hard like to tag resources from different cloud providers, cloud regions, but it's really like, I would say like it's one of also the main like feature that allows you like to understand and break down your costs. So start by tagging your resources first, and start like by connecting Commissioner to your infrastructure, and start like slow and small, and by like creating the different dashboards for your team so that they can know like the impact of like their actions and how the infrastructure is being used by them. And I think you will be surprised at how many developers will be willing to take actions to reduce the cost or improve the performance of the infrastructure. And this is something I've been like know from as I said, from a first-hand experience back then. The company I worked at, like I was part of the DevOps team, and we were spending our time like giving the developers team the support. So we didn't like spend our time on improving the infrastructure, because like we were mostly doing firefighting.
Yeah.
But once we started like creating dashboards to show the developers like how the infrastructure looks like for their services, and like the money they are spending on the cloud, like they have been like giving us like ideas and suggestions, and also they will be more willing to go to the extra mile to understand how they can optimize the cost and the infrastructure overall. So I would say like start as early as you can, because this information can help you like not only like reduce the cost, but also avoid like security threats and vulnerability issues in the long run.
What would you recommend tech leader in a large organization, let's say, not a small startup where everyone knows everyone and you tell people to, take care of costs and they do it, but let's say 400 engineer organization. What are the best practices there to give developers accountability, or hold them accountable for the cloud spend?
I think like we have built Commissar to be collaborative, because that's also it's one of like the ideas also of FinOps, is that like the developers, the management, and the product teams like collaborate together with the financial team. And I think today, like with this open source project, anyone can use it. And I think once they start like using tags, they will be like anyone will be involved on the process of like inspecting like the hidden like cost, waste, or the hidden resources that are not used anymore. So it's more about like engaging everyone at the organization, the product. It's not mostly for DevOps or the CFO to think about that part, but it's something that anyone should be accountable on how the infrastructure is being used.
Yeah. Where do you think this is going in the future? I've seen recently, Hey email went back from cloud to on-premise because of costs. Do you have a stance on where we'll be in 5 years?
I think like now a lot of people, especially developers, are more concerned about cost optimization, especially this year,
Yeah.
like with all the security issues and also like the complexity of cloud providers, as I said. So I think now more people are more interested like to adopt FinOps practices, to empower developers to understand how the infrastructure works. So I would say that's something will be like one of the main trends in the upcoming years is like more companies interested on understanding how their cloud infrastructure is working, especially with the different regulation like GDPR and others that makes like companies are more concerned about the security posture of their infrastructure.
Nice, nice, nice.
That's why like we have also the rise of like new like not new terms, but it's more like evolution of DevOps, like platform engineering. We want developers more like empowered with the different tools so that they can like serve the business in a better way by leveraging different tools. And I think Commissaire is also one of those tools that could allow developers to understand better how to use the cloud.
Nice. And let's go back to your person. How do you currently spend your time between tech and management? And do you have recommendations for listeners on how to do this well?
Yeah, so I'm not an individual contributor, that's for sure. I
Yeah.
try to pick some open GitHub issues from time to another, but I try to be available for the team to answer the questions, concerns, or just like have the bigger picture of the puzzle. And so, but I'm still like involved when it comes to the community. As I said, we have an open source community, and also when it comes to creating content and shaping the product roadmap.
Mm. Do you remember the first time you ever automated something?
That's a good question. I don't recall the first time, but the first that came to my mind is back then when I have been working at this company in the cloud space. Like we have been, as I said, connecting enterprises, the cloud providers. So basically, we have been connected directly to the data centers of those cloud providers like AWS and GCP. We have been present on those data centers. And like we had this challenge of like having insights about the infrastructure we serve to our customers in terms of like the health check of the infrastructure, in terms of like the throughput, in terms of the error rates and stuff like that. So we end up like using Raspberry Pis. So we sent like Raspberry Pis all over data centers across the world, like in the US and France, Belgium, UK, etc., and Singapore. And we like automated the process so that when we connect the Raspberry Pi for the first time to the data center, it will be connecting to a discovery service which will be collecting all the IP addresses of the Raspberry Pis so that they can ping each other. And then we collect this data with the data collector to send it to our time series database so that we can like build some dashboards from Grafana so that we can serve to our customers to get these insights. I think that would be like the most interesting way of automating like the network
Yeah.
part that I can recall.
Nice, nice, nice. Another story from the past. Can you share one of like a funny or interesting on-call situation or production crashing situation?
Yeah, I won't say it's a funny situation, but it's something also to explain the complexity of cloud providers today. Like back then, like we have been using like MongoDB for for data persistency, and like the cost of MongoDB since we have been using the enterprise edition of MongoDB was start to be expensive. And during that time, AWS like came up with the new service called DocumentDB, which is MongoDB compatible. So we're the first early adopter of that service and production. Of course, we have done a small proof of concept. It was successful. So we decided to migrate all our data to this new service, like the data I'm talking about, terabytes of data that we store on a daily basis. Like fast forward, we found out that the service is not yet fully like ready for production uses because
Yeah.
a lot of operations are not ready. So we end up like moving back to MongoDB Enterprise Edition, which like we wasted a lot of like time and efforts and also like a lot of money that was wasted. So I would say like the takeaway from this story is like, do not trust cloud providers when they release a new service. Make sure to test it out to make sure it's ready for production usage, because most of the time it's mostly like a small like or an MVP of the service to get the feedback from customers, which is was the case for document DB, our example.
Mm-hmm. Nice. We touched earlier upon the newsletter that you write. So you're the editor, but you also started it, right? The DevOps Bulletin newsletter.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do you personally stay up to date and consume information?
It's funny because I have started the newsletter because I want to stay up to date. So it's a way for me to stay up to date because, as I said, I was working on a company in the HR space. So I was like not involved fully in the DevOps and the cloud space. So I have started the newsletter. Like currently, I get the news from Hacker News, Reddit, and from some Discord and Slack communities. It's like my source of information and truth when it comes to different trends and what's happening in the space.
Nice. And what trends kind of do you see? Because you've been writing weekly for 4 years now. What are some interesting learnings you can share?
The most interesting one is like, of course, recently the rise of platform engineering as a way to make like developers more empowered. And also like the FinOps, as I said, like now more companies and more developers are worried about the costs and also the infrastructure. So they want to know how it works. So I would say like those are the most like trends that I have seen in the last few months. Of course, also with the rise of AI also, which
Yeah.
start to be also the main like stories.
Yeah. ChatGPT everywhere.
Yeah.
What are the anti-stories though? What are things that you wrote frequently about 4 years ago, but you don't anymore because they're not that current?
That's an interesting question. I would say like Jenkins, even though it's still like widely adopted, but like I think like now with a lot of competition, especially now it's pretty integrated. You can have this CI/CD platform with your GitLab or GitHub, so a lot of people are adopting this kind of tools. So I would say like this is like the tool that I don't see a lot when it comes like to different news and different like updates, which was a tool that I have been using a lot on my previous companies.
Nice. Who's your favorite content creator that isn't you or me?
He's not a content creator, but he's like an author of multiple engineering management books, which is Will Larson, which is the City of Call. So I really like his books, and also he has also a monthly newsletter where he shares like his insights about leadership and engineering management, which I found really insightful.
Nice. How much has your newsletter shifted as your own role shifted from, individual contributor to tech management?
So like the newsletter, I would say like, of course, like I'm the only person like who managed the newsletter. So it's very hard like to find a balance between like a founder and also like serving content like to readers. Like today, I would say like it become one of the most popular newsletter in terms of like number of subscribers. It has 140,000 subscribers. So like, but at the same time, it's also, as I said, for me, it was mostly for me to stay up to date. It wasn't like to create content, but just to force me like to be up to date because it's something which is very important for us since we want to stay relevant and competitive on our space. As I said, we need to be aware of all the new services, new cloud providers, if we want to like build a platform for the 99% of developers. So I would say it's also a way for me also to stay relevant and know what's happening in this space.
Yeah, nice. How in your learnings and in the content you consume, how do you balance fundamental learnings with current trends?
I think they are both important. I think you need to find a balance, like of course by understanding the basics and the foundations and the frameworks and best practices, but at the same time like know like the different trends and stay up to date. Of course, I don't like consume everything, like you need to take everything with a pinch of salt, but at least you need to be aware of what's happening because like on our space, a lot of things are evolving. Like from a day to another, there's new tools, new providers, new platforms. So you need like to know about what's happening in the space. So I would say like you need like to know about the fundamentals, but also stay like up to date with the different trends.
So of your learning time, what's the ratio? Is it like 50-50 or?
Yeah, I would say like that. Like most of the time, I try to to stay up to date, of course, while like preparing the newsletter or the weekly digest, but also like during the weekends. As I said, I subscribe to different newsletters, and also I'm part of some like Discord and Slack communities, which also helps to stay up to date.
Nice. How much do you learn per week, like dedicated learning?
I cannot give you an exact percentage,
Yeah.
but at least like I try like on the weekends to have some dedicated like time to like browse the internet, and of course I during the week I'm already subscribed to different news aggregator and stuff like that, so that also helps to find the right information. But I don't have really an exact percentage. I would say like never stop learning, and I think it's something which is true for any role or at any level. So that would be my advice for anyone. But in terms of exact percentage, is not something I try like to think about. It's mostly for me. It's just like to stay up to date and try to learn as much as I can.
Nice, awesome. I mean, it also intertwines with work, right? Like sometimes it's like you need we already touched upon it earlier, but I'd like to pick your brain a little bit more on this and kind of like the future of where DevOps is headed. And let's start with open source. I've recently spoken with someone who claimed that open source is dying. What's your stance, and what can be done to make it better?
No, I don't think open source is dying. I think even open source is aging software. Like open source is used everywhere, even on the space. And I think like now, as you can see, even on like from the investor perspective, a lot of companies now that have launched on the open source space, like a lot of successful stories like HashiCorp. So I don't think it's something which is true. Of course, there are a lot of challenges on the open source space. I think that one of the challenges, like of course, is to have like the telemetry or understand the product usage, which can be like very tricky, not only for companies that work on the open source space, because they need to prove to their investors that what they are working on has traction and it's something that has a value, but also for individual contributors. Like if you contribute to the open source project, you want to know that what you are working on and what you are delivering has an impact. And I think this could change in the future, because I think there are already some initiative from GitHub like to have this kind of insights and those metrics. Also, another challenge is when it comes like to rewarding the community. As I said, like a lot of companies are using open source projects. There are, of course, some initiatives like to reward the community and reward the maintainers for their work. And I would say also another challenge is the licensing of open source projects, which is one of the pains for a lot of companies when they start an open source project. Is like, of course, they want to keep the core features open to public, but at the same time they want to protect their business model. So I would say there are challenges, but in terms of like if the open source is dying, it's not something which is true, because as I said, there is a lot of companies on this space that are very successful and even unicorns. And as I said, like open source is 18 software.
So what do you think is the influence on the open source community of having more and more companies produce open source software, where maybe 20 years ago it was more really like individual people in their rooms?
Like I think now that also with the initiative, like now we have like GitHub sponsorship program that also helps and also reward like community. And also I would say like even to speak from a personal perspective, for me contributing to open source was the most rewarding experience for me, because not only I give back to the community, but I have learned a lot and also like opened the door for me. So it's something which I highly recommend for anyone I want to start on the on the open source, or to be a developer or a DevOps. There's a lot of opportunities. So I think this is also like make also like on the VC sides like something which is very interesting and very exciting for them, because there is a lot of like noise, there is a lot of like engagement from the community, and also there is a lot of innovation that are coming from the open source space. And that's why we have also made Commissioner Open Source, because we know that this issue, this challenge we are trying to solve cannot be solved on a closed source model. It should be open source. And I think like the open source, when it comes to transparency and the engagement, the contribution can help us on solving that. So I would say like this is something that has been like the trend, and a lot of like companies have been leveraging open source to build a successful business and also like grow their open source community.
Nice. What's the best non-obvious way that open source projects can tell their contributors how impactful they are?
I would say like first is to having like the telemetry, like understanding like how many like people are downloading the tool,
Yeah.
and also where they are coming from. Understand also like the feature, like the feature usage that was contributed by that person also can help. There is a lot of initiative recently like to have this kind of platform that allows you like to have this kind of data without breaching the data privacy, because that's also one of the trickiest questions on the open source.
Yeah.
So I would say like those kind of insights could be really useful to understand the impact of the open source contribution by a particular individual.
Yeah, fair. Is there a way to measure the amount of end users that use this project? I mean, that would be really cool, right?
Yeah, like I think there is today some ways to do that, but it's still very tricky. Like you can use
Yeah,
like
yeah.
tools like segments to do that, but I think you need also to have a way for people to opt out if they want. But like it's still like very tricky. That's why like I think the initiative can be like more like easy to implement if it's coming from like Git repository management
Yeah.
companies like GitHub and GitLab, because they have this information at least when it comes to the number of downloads. I think that could be already like a good metric to track.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. What's something controversial you believe about DevOps?
For me, I strongly believe that DevOps is not a job. I
Mm.
think DevOps for me is a set of practices, it's a culture.
Yeah.
The same when it comes to like when developers says that my own responsibility stops at writing code. I think that's also one of the reasons why I switched to DevOps, because for me it was a natural like natural option or natural like transition, because DevOps just made me more empowered, more productive, and that's what we want to do also with Tailwarden, is to make like developers like more empowered and make them take control back of the infrastructure by making the cloud more transparent and collaborative.
Yeah, yeah. Apart from these hidden costs, what are some other DevOps issues nobody talks about?
Yeah, I think one of the issues, of course, as I said in the beginning, is the firefighting. Like I know, and also this is coming from my personal experience back then. Like I know that a lot of DevOps and SREs are like under pressure
Yeah,
because they need like to switch between desk time, like handling the support, and at the same time thinking about the infrastructure improvements, improving the documentation and processes. So I think this is also one of the main issues a lot of DevOps and SREs are struggling with. That's why like we need to empower more developers so that they can also do their part of the job to make the like the collaboration smoother between like DevOps and the developers. And that's why like you have now this rise of platform engineering as a way to make
yeah.
developers more like aware of different tools so that they can build platforms internally to serve the business and to serve the growth of the company.
Nice, nice. Awesome. Last question for today. What part of DevOps will never be automated out of existence?
That's interesting. I would say collaboration, even though like with AI and tools and also automations that could streamline the collaboration, but I feel like the user understanding, like the empathy, it's something that cannot be automated. So that's would be my take
Nice,
on what things that won't be automated in the future.
nice. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me today. How can listeners find you online if they have follow-up questions, or where can they find you and your newsletter?
Yeah, they can find me on Twitter or just drop me a message on LinkedIn.
Mhm.
Beside that, it was really fun talking with you. Thanks
Awesome.
for having me.
Awesome. Thanks for joining. Bye.
Thanks.